It's time. I'm going after the biggest at the base or the top. Oh, fun. I totally didn't expect that.
What do we have here?
A 3-in-1. Whoa. What the heck?
That's a confused carrot.
Whoa, this is gonna be more fun than I thought. Do you ever feel like in the dead of winter, you make all of these extravagant gardening plans, but then pretty quickly the plans start to go south, and by the time you're transplanting the starts that you've poured your heart and soul into over the winter, by the time you're putting those into the garden, they yellow, they die, you're getting lackluster results? If you said yes to any of those things, then this video is definitely for you. Today, we're gonna talk about the biggest transplanting mistakes that gardeners make, keeping them from having the garden that they dream of. I've been actively gardening for 6 years now, and this video is a little bit embarrassing to make because some of these things you would think one would know better, but you only learn from experience why it's so critical to not make these mistakes and how seemingly small things really aren't that small at all. Okay, without any further waiting, let's just jump right into it. The biggest mistake a lot of people make is not potting up their starts. So the first year I decided to start my own seeds, I had these little cells here. And when I was buying them, the information said they're great for things like tomatoes. So I took that very literally. I put my tomatoes in there, I put my peppers in there, and guess what? When it was time to transplant, I had these itty bitty starts. They were so tiny that I went out the next morning and half of them were gone. They were just so tiny. They were so susceptible to the elements and probably pests. And good thing I planted double than what I needed because I was able to replace the plants quickly as they died off. But man, that was a brutal year. Everything did eventually catch up to size, but let's not do that. Instead, what I learned is as soon as your plant starts growing, you know, maybe you start a couple of them and you prune the weak one. That's what we like to do. Or we just plant one per cell and some of them don't germinate, and that's okay because you're not wasting a lot of space. But as soon as you get a plant about that size, it's time to uppot. And before you know it, you're gonna have a start that rivals nursery starts. Okay, maybe not literally, but I could tell you this is gonna grow a lot of tomatoes. I used to only uppot a couple years after that, big things like tomatoes and peppers. But this year I said, hey, let's uppot everything, or most everything. So here's some violas that I uppotted, and that's a pretty good little start there. But it never would be this size if we didn't uppot. We even uppotted our broccoli this year, and man, I'll tell you, we set out some honkers of starts. Check out this basil. That's a really healthy plant right there, but it wouldn't get to this size if it didn't have a big enough container. They say that a fish grows to the size of its tank, and that can be more true with starts. The next mistake is not fertilizing your starts when they're still inside. This is again something I didn't do for a couple of years. But some of these plants, these trooper plants, they could be inside for up to 3 months. That's a very long time. So when your seed first sprouts and it puts out 2 tiny little leaves, that provides everything the plant needs. But as soon as that's gone and their true leaves appear, and you know it's a true leaf because it looks like the leaf of the plant that you're growing. It's very obvious. So a pepper leaf looks like a pepper plant, and a tomato leaf looks like a tomato plant. As soon as you see those appear, you want to start fertilizing your plants. And there's different fertilizers you can use, and you don't need to fertilize every time you water, but you know, once a week, once every couple of weeks, that's a pretty good rule of thumb. Anything you do is better than nothing. To be completely honest, I only fertilized my peppers and everything else a couple of times this year because I was extremely busy. And you know, they could be a little bit more green, but this is a very good pepper start. And if you look very closely, there's already little pepper buds on there. So that's pretty incredible. This is a huge change from when I first starting my seeds indoors. This is what I personally like to use. It's a fish and seaweed fertilizer. I think this is a very great option, especially for people that want to take an extremely natural approach. The best way I found to fertilize, because this stuff is pretty stinky, what I do is just pour a little bit, you don't need much, the instructions should be on here how much to use, so definitely follow that recommendation, not what I'm saying, is I pour that into my 10-20 trays, and then I use a hose and I dilute it, because if you just dump it and fill it up and you don't push it around, when that dries out, oh baby, it smells worse than rotting potatoes. Really quick interruption. If you're enjoying these tips and tricks, I want to take a moment to invite you to check out my ebook, 11 Mistakes Keeping You from Your Best Garden Yet. It's a collection of the biggest mistakes I've made to date, and some of them might not be what you think. If you feel like you have a lot of book knowledge, you feel like you're doing all the right things, but you're just not getting the results, you might want to take a look. It's for people who seriously want to up their gardening game. To find it, go to sassycarrot.com or visit the link in the description of this video. All right, back to the video. The next mistake a lot of gardeners make is not hardening off your starts. I know you have all heard it, but if you're anything like me, time sneaks up on you and you don't harden off your starts. I've always taken the approach, you gotta be tough or you got no place in my garden. But I'll tell you, that's not the best mindset to have if you're trying to grow a lot of food in a reasonable amount of time. The best way to harden off your starts is prior to transplanting, maybe a couple weeks out. I mean, you could start earlier if you want, but you start putting your plants outside. First, it's ideal to leave them in some shade, but just think about it. They've been in an extremely comfortable environment that's temperature controlled, with no temperature extremes, no wind, no rain, their entire life. And if you just shove them into the garden, they're not going to like that, because they have to adapt to the real world. All right, little guys, are you ready to go to your forever home?
No, we want to stay inside where it's safe.
I know, seedlings. A ship in the harbor is safe, but that's not what ships are built for. So if you start exposing them to the outside, starting with maybe just 2 hours, it is a little bit of a pain because you have to move all of your starts in and out. In our case, we just open up our garage door and it's very easy to just move the trays outside. I promise you it's worth the effort. And you start with a couple hours, and maybe you go to 3, then 4, then you start exposing them to direct sunshine, and you try to work yourself up to leaving them outside all day long. In fact, you could even get to the point where they're spending the night outside. We just don't do that because if it's not in a fenced area, the deer can get it. But right now, because I'm waiting to plant and I'm still kind of arranging things, the starts do live outside and they're perfectly hardened off, and it's so amazing. Last year, I could not find the time. I was so busy, I didn't harden my plants off, and I shoved them in the garden on a sunny day. And what they did was they wilted and they yellowed so bad, and I had a couple nursery starts to compare them to, and I genuinely thought I was gonna lose a bunch of my plants. They did come back to life. They were happy, but another way is, even if they do survive, you could be taking, a week or 2 off the time it takes them to fruit. So that's really critical when you have a short growing season like we do in zone 6. We wanna make sure that we're giving them everything they need to produce a lot of fruit before our early first frost. This is some sorrel. They haven't taken too well to the hardening off process, but this looks like a really pathetic plant, but it's actually quite hardy. So I have faith that these guys are gonna come out just fine. But other starts, this is a lettuce leaf basil. This is new this year. I'm really excited about it. But these look amazing. I'm extremely happy with those. They're ready to go in the garden. Another mistake to avoid if you want to give yourself the best chances possible to have a thriving garden right out of the gate is to wait until a cloudy or overcast day to transplant. Getting into its final home is enough of a shocker and stress, even if you've properly hardened off your plants. So waiting for an overcast day is ideal. Sometimes you only have a small window, and guess what? It's sunny. So at the end of the day, I wouldn't worry about that. Last year, I put my unhardened off plants right into the garden on an extremely sunny and hot day, and most survived. But that's not the route to go to be thriving and growing early on. It just so happens today and the next couple of days to be overcast, so I unintentionally timed that very well for planting day. The next mistake to avoid, and it's something that isn't directly having to do with your starts, but it's something a lot of people can easily miss. And you might think once again that your starts aren't very healthy, but that is to test your soil. I have a blog post on how to do that, kind of comparing some of the different methods. I'll link to that in the description below this video, but we get our soil professionally tested from a legitimate laboratory every single year. And we actually do that at the end of the season because that helps us get a jump start on things we need to add to ensure that we're staying on top of any growing or existing soil issues. And I share that in more detail in our ebook that we had a legitimate soil issue and it took us 2 years to identify, but with a proper soil test, we were able to get on top of it and immediately change the trajectory of our garden. So that's something I can't stress enough, is making sure that your soil health is good. Because if you're having a problem again and again and you just feel that you're doing all the right things and you're not getting the results that you think you should be getting, try testing your soil. The next mistake is not preparing your soil before you transplant. It's much easier to work in the soil before you have all your plants in and now you're having to work around them. So what we do is, regardless of what our soil tests show, we make sure to amend it with compost before every single planting. You can't have too much compost. And then we add some extra nitrogen. This is something that our soil tests say that we need, despite all of the compost that we add. So we follow the instructions that we were given, and then also we look at the recommendations on the material itself. But it's so important to have everything prepped before transplant day. Then your job is extremely easy and fun. The next mistake to avoid, and not everyone needs this, but I find it to be particularly helpful, but that's to set out all of your transplants wherever they go before you start putting them into the soil. Because I have a particularly high productivity garden and we do very intense planting methods, I want to make sure that I'm maximizing every square inch of growing space as best as possible. So again, I find it extremely helpful to just set everything out. And I find when I do that, that I deviate from my plans sometimes, working with what grew versus what I planned for. And it also allows me to tap into my inner creativity and have a little bit of fun with what I want where. In the case this year, I grew way too many peppers. I have so many pepper plants, but I was able to play with the spacing of them. I have, I think, 5 different varieties in here, so I can kind of prioritize what I want to grow. I can make changes, and then I can hopefully find spots to stuff the overflow, fill in all the gaps, so to say. But this is something that really takes the pressure off gardening. And if you're lucky to have any gardening helpers, then this is helpful for them too, because you already decided what you wanted to plant where. And then all they have to do is dig a hole and stick it in the ground. It's extremely easy and makes planting fun instead of stressful. The next mistake to avoid is not planting your starts deep enough. I'll show you in a minute how to properly plant one of these suckers, but specifically I want to call attention to planting tomatoes deep. Check this out. You'll see here that this is a particularly leggy tomato. And what that means is you can think of it as having extremely long legs. This tomato is not very bushy, and you would never see this in a nursery. Nursery starts are much more compact. But don't fear, because you can save this. Believe it or not, last year I had tomatoes that were probably 2.5 feet tall. It was embarrassing. But a lot of people don't know the secret that you can plant a tomato as deep as you want. You can seriously just leave the tip sticking out. For us, we can't do that because our beds aren't that deep. But all of these little prickles on the stems will actually just turn into roots. So that's incredible. You can pinch these guys off in that case. That's probably the right thing to do, and the plant will be just fine. Another thing you can do, and I got to try this out firsthand and it worked, is you can dig a trench for your tomato like that. If you have shallow soil like we do, and you can trench it and then turn the plant up where you want it to come out of the ground. And provided you don't snap the tomato in half, that works just fine. A lot of people don't know this, but indeterminate tomatoes, they're actually a vine, and they just keep growing and growing and growing. So that's all you're doing, is you're turning your tomato sideways like that, and then you're coming out of the ground wherever you want. That's also helpful because sometimes you get like little jogs like that in your plants and they're trying to go sideways. In the case of a tomato, just bury that sucker, it'll be fine. I'm just gonna do one plant to show you guys. It seems basic, but I promise you there's someone out there that doesn't know this stuff. You wanna dig a hole, put all that fresh soil to the side. You wanna squeeze your container like that, kind of loosen it. You wanna be very gentle. You don't wanna damage the plant. So the best thing to do is just tip it over like that. And see all those roots in there? Place it nicely in the ground. You don't want it too deep. You don't want to bury the stem, but you don't want it too shallow either. So you do want to cover your entire, I'm going to call it a soil block for sake of this video. Sometimes you could put a little bit more dirt in there to bring it to the level that you want, but then you just want to sprinkle this in nice and good. You don't want it too compact, but you want to make sure that you're getting good contact all around. The plant's really going to like that. And then I usually cover like that, so it looks like the plant is just coming straight out of the ground. That should be a very happy pepper right there. You're also going to want to make sure that you keep these babies watered, especially the first few days after transplanting. You don't want the soil to get super dry because they're already undergoing stress from adapting to their new home. They don't need the additional stress of not having enough water to drink. Another mistake gardeners make is after they transplant, not pruning off some of the lower branches that are in contact with the soil. The reason you want to do this is because plants are more susceptible to disease when their foliage is laying on top of the soil. Believe it or not, something like a tomato doesn't need that many leaves. I mean, you don't want to take all of them off, but if you have a few good branches on there, you should be fine. So in this case, I planted this one nice and deep, which by the way is also going to allow a really solid root structure to form instead of having a floppy tomato plant that wants to blow over. But this guy needs to come off. There's enough leaves on this plant without keeping that guy on there, and all he's doing is laying on the soil. So now that it's planted, I'm just gonna go ahead and take my thumb like that and pinch it off. As your plant gets a lot bigger and you can't do that with your thumb, you're gonna wanna use some small pruning scissors, and that's just gonna make the cut a lot cleaner. You don't wanna prune it and end up taking off a bunch of the stem. That's just gonna make it more susceptible to disease. I'm gonna go ahead and take this guy off too. So now that plant has nothing touching the ground except that leaf in the back, just a little bit. Tomatoes can get pretty out of control after growing for a couple of months, so let's just take that guy off. Let's see what else. Here's a couple. Here is a ground cherry start, and you can see the top of the plant looks really good, and some of these earlier leaves are kind of yellowing, and once I plant it, there's going to even be some buds. Pretty challenging to see, but if you look closely in there, there's going to be some buds that are full blown at ground level. I'm probably just going to go ahead and pinch those off. You just want to make sure after you plant, your start is nice and clean and nothing is touching the soil. So those are the biggest mistakes that gardeners make when transplanting their starts into the garden. If you found this video helpful and you learned a thing or two, or you know someone that might find value in this video, please like and share it, and hopefully we can save a fellow gardener from making some of these same mistakes. If you're a newer gardener, don't stress out too much if you feel that you've made some of these mistakes. At the end of the day, gardens are extremely resilient. That said, it's really nice to know that if you're making some of these mistakes, there is hope and there's things that you can improve on year after year. And that's personally what I strive for every year, is just to have a better garden than I did last year. I did not expect that.
You know what's funny is it looks like these two carrots are hugging that carrot.
They're all hugging.
They're all hugging.
I just don't know how many carrot people are hugging in this
carrot
mob.
family. Do we clean it now or do we wait till we harvest everything?
I think we'll harvest the rest and then we'll probably squirt them all off with the hose.
Okay. That's awesome.